Shalom and welcome back to The Final Marriage, the dramatic love story of Israel and the Church. I'm Dr. Andre Villeneuve. Stepping back into our journey, we now arrive at a turning point in the story. In part 1, we followed the great arc of salvation history, from Abraham to the Messiah, and we ended with Jesus' ascension. Now in part 2, the story continues with Pentecost, the moment when the Holy Spirit descends upon the disciples and the church is born from within Israel. But from this moment forward, the narrative becomes more complex and more painful. The early chapters of Acts show thousands of Jews embracing Jesus as Messiah, yet they also show the beginnings of tension, misunderstanding, and rejection. What begins as a family dispute within Israel slowly becomes a widening rift between Jews and Gentile believers. This is the mystery we now enter, the Passion of Israel. Like the Passion of the Messiah, it is a story marked by suffering, betrayal, and tears. And yet also like the Passion of the Messiah, it is not without purpose. It is a mystery that calls for humility, repentance, and a willingness to see history through God's eyes rather than our own. Before we begin, please like this video, subscribe to our channel, click the notification bell, and share your thoughts in the comments below. Jesus has concluded his earthly mission and has gone back to the Father. 50 days after his Paschal mystery, the church is born at Pentecost in Jerusalem. The Holy Spirit falls upon the apostles and they come out and preach the gospel of the crucified Messiah. Here is from St. Peter's speech in Jerusalem, where he proclaims to the Jews assembled in Jerusalem for Shavuot, saying, "Repent and let every one of you be baptized in the name of Jesus Christ for the remission of sins, and you shall receive the gift of the Holy Spirit." It's the birth of the church. And what is the church? Well, the initial intention of the church is that it is to be the place of the reconciliation of Jew and Gentile. The church is the spiritual and universal fulfillment of God's promises to Israel. As we saw last time, Jesus recapitulated in his own life the history of Israel, and the church will continue this recapitulation. At the beginning, the church is entirely Jewish. The idea is not to start a new religion, but the idea is that the Messiah of Israel has come to fulfill the mission of Israel and lead Israel into the fullness of her mission and her calling. So the early church is entirely Jewish, and the first Gentile Christian who enters the church is a Roman centurion called Cornelius. You can read about that story in the Acts of the Apostles, chapter 10. Following the entrance of Cornelius into the church, there's a big debate among the apostles as to what they should do with these Gentiles who are beginning to flock into the church. Do they need to convert to Judaism first? Do they need to be circumcised and keep the Torah of Moses? Or can they enter the church? Can they enter the new people of God without having to convert to Judaism? This is, of course, the debate at the heart of the Council of Jerusalem, and you can read about that in Acts chapter 15. The apostles decide that Gentile Christians do not need to convert to Judaism, that they can be received within the church and still preserve their identity without having to become Jews. At the same time, the situation in the book of Acts is that Jewish Christians also did not cease to be Jews. The very debate in Acts 15 presupposes that the Jewish Christian apostles were still observing the Torah. Otherwise, there would have been no debate about the question of Gentiles, whether they need to observe the Torah and be circumcised. So the early Jewish Christians, including the apostles, did not cease to be Jews. You can read about that especially in Acts 21, where the great apostle Paul makes a vow to disprove accusations that he is leading Jews away from observing the Torah, from observing the law. And as Paul makes this vow, he is proving that he himself is still living in observance of the Torah. So Acts 21 is a crucial chapter to understand that Jews and Gentiles coexisted in the early church without abolishing the distinctions of each one of them. Still, most Jews reject Jesus, and this is going to lead to the great drama of what does it mean for Israel? Has Israel been rejected because most Jews have rejected the Jewish Messiah? Is Israel's identity and mission now transferred to the church? Has Israel lost her calling and mission? And Paul grapples with this question in his epistle to the Romans, especially chapters 9 to 11. Now we're going to look at a very important passage from chapter 11 of Romans. There, Paul writes, "If some of the branches were broken off, and you, a wild olive shoot, were grafted in their place to share the rich fruit of the olive tree, do not boast over the branches. If you do boast, remember that it is not you that support the root, but the root that supports you." What's going on here? The branches that were broken off are the unbelieving Jews who did not receive the Messiah. They have been broken off from the olive tree of Israel. Who are the wild olive shoots? They are the Gentile Christians who were grafted in the place of the unbelieving Jews. Paul goes on to warn these Gentile Christians to not boast over these branches that have been broken off. And he reminds them by saying, if you do boast, remember it's not you that support the root, but still the root of Israel that supports you. Paul continues, "You will say branches were broken off so that I might be grafted in. That is true. They were broken off because of their unbelief. But you stand only through faith. So do not become proud, but stand in awe. For if God did not spare the natural branches, perhaps he will not spare you. Note then the kindness and the severity of God. Severity toward those who have fallen, but God's kindness towards you, provided you continue in his kindness. Otherwise, you also will be cut off." What is Paul saying? He's warning these Gentile Christians to approach this mystery of Israel with humility. The Gentile Christians were grafted in. The unbelieving Jews were broken off the tree. But you Gentiles, you only stand through your faith, and so don't become proud. Don't become boastful towards the broken branches, because God will not spare you either if you become proud and arrogant and if you boast against the branches. You also may be cut off. And then Paul concludes by saying, "And even those of Israel, if they do not persist in unbelief, will be grafted in, for God has the power to graft them in again. For if you have been cut from what is by nature a wild olive tree, and grafted contrary to nature into a cultivated olive tree, how much more will these natural branches be grafted back into their own olive tree?" So following this warning to the Gentiles, he seems to be anticipating that the natural branches will be grafted back into their tree, namely that God still has a place for the Jewish people in the olive tree of salvation. We're going to return near the end of this study of Israel and the church and unpack Romans 11 even a little more. But for now, Judaism is going to experience a profound transformation. In 32 AD, with the crucifixion of Christ, the temple veil is torn, indicating that now humanity has a new access to the heavenly Holy of Holies through the death of the Messiah. In 66 AD, war breaks out between the Jews and the Romans. It's the great Jewish revolt that is going to lead to the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem in 70 AD. The war will last another 3 years, and it will be devastating for the Jews. After the destruction of the temple, Judaism has to redefine itself in order to survive. So we see a shift from biblical Judaism to rabbinic Judaism, whereas Judaism is now centered on the synagogue and on the study and observance of the Torah, rather than on the temple and its sacrifices. So a real transformation of Judaism here in the late 1st century, but it doesn't mean that there's no continuity. It's still the same Jewish people and the same Judaism, only that it has become transformed after the destruction of the temple. Revolt and dispersion of the Jews. In 132 AD, another war breaks out between the Jews and the Romans. This is known as the Bar Kokhba revolt. Once again, the Jews are crushed. The rebellion is crushed, Jews are sold into slavery or exiled, and they are forbidden entrance into Jerusalem. So the Jews are completely exiled from Jerusalem and the surrounding areas. Emperor Hadrian renames the city of Jerusalem Aelia Capitolina, and he also renames Judea to become Palestina, namely Palestine. It's from that time on that the Holy Land begins to be named Palestine. Any use of Palestine before 132 to 135 is basically an anachronism. This is not how the land used to be called in the time of Jesus or before that. It only begins at the time of Emperor Hadrian after the Bar Kokhba revolt. This begins the diaspora, the dispersion of the Jews that will last over 18 centuries. So the exile of the Jews was not over with the exile in Babylonia. It starts anew with the diaspora following the two revolts in Judea in the 1st and 2nd centuries. Scholars refer to this period as the time of the parting of the ways between the church and the synagogue. How did that happen? Well, there was a gradual increase of the number of Gentiles in the church. Recall that the early church was entirely Jewish, but this did not last very long. So gradually we see more and more Gentiles entering the church, and the majority of Jews still reject Jesus. This means that the Jewish Christians, who were the entirety of the initial church, they eventually become a minority and they are caught in the middle. They're excluded by the Jewish community because they believe in Jesus, but they're also increasingly excluded and castigated by the Gentile Christians because they insist on holding on to Judaism. So those who were the initial Christians, the Jewish Christians, eventually dwindle and disappear. At first, there is a Jewish persecution of the nascent church, and by the time Constantine legalizes Christianity in 313 AD, the Jewish Christian communities have nearly disappeared. So from that moment on, Christianity becomes a predominantly Gentile religion, separated from its Jewish roots. So this is what we call the parting of the ways, whereas Christianity at first was entirely a Jewish movement. From about the 4th century on, we see an almost total separation between Judaism and Christianity becomes largely a Gentile religion. This begins what we might call the Passion of Israel, the Jewish people on the road to Calvary. And this is poignantly illustrated in this painting from Marc Chagall, where we see the Jewish Messiah in the middle who participates in the suffering and in the exile and in the passion of his people. So this is where we enter a very difficult chapter in the history of Jewish-Christian relations. It's not only difficult, but it's all but forgotten among Christians and Catholics. And here is an important paragraph from an essential book that played a big part in my own understanding of Israel, written by Father Edward Flannery, a Catholic priest in the 1960s, and this book is called The Anguish of the Jews, where he traces the long and painful history of Christian anti-Semitism. Why do Catholics not know about this history? Well, Father Flannery explains this right here. He writes, Jews generally are acutely aware of the history of anti-Semitism, simply because it comprises so large a portion of Jewish history. Christians, on the contrary, are all but totally ignorant of it, for the simple reason that anti-Semitism does not appear in their history books. The pages Jews have memorized have been torn from our histories of the Christian era. Very important statement here, that the history of anti-Semitism is very deep in the Jewish consciousness, but these pages have been torn from our histories of the Christian era, so that most Christians are completely ignorant about this history. And significantly, this is what we see in the image here. We see these two statues that are still seen on the cathedral in Strasbourg in France, where on the top you can see the triumphant ecclesia, the triumphant church, and on the bottom right you can see the blindfolded synagoga, the blinded synagogue who is unable to see the truth. So this very much points to this triumphant attitude, not to say this arrogant or triumphalistic attitude of the church toward the synagogue. As we begin this journey through the Passion of Israel, let's remember the Abrahamic blessing. Those who bless you, I will bless. Those who curse you, I will curse. And let us see what kind of behavior the church has displayed in her relationship with Israel. Also recalling the analogy of the olive tree, where Paul warns the Gentile Christians, do not boast over the branches, because God may also cut you off. This difficult history begins with the church fathers and the development of what later became known as replacement theology or supersessionism. This is the beginning of a theological and polemical offensive against Judaism and the development of supersessionism or replacement theology, sometimes known also as the theology of substitution. What is that? Well, there are several elements to this theory or theology. First, The church is now the new and true Israel, and since this is the case, God must have revoked his election and covenant with Israel. Second, the Jews have rejected and killed Jesus, the Son of God. They are therefore known as Christ killers and even God killers who are guilty of deicide. This becomes an important theme among many of the church fathers. Third, the curses of the Old Testament are directed toward the Jews, while the promises and blessings of the Old Testament are spiritualized and seized by the church as her own. This is, of course, really problematic exegesis. When you read the Old Testament, all the curses are for the Jews and all the blessings are for the church. No, of course, both the blessings and the curses were originally meant for Israel, and the church also partakes in the blessings and the curses according to her own behavior. Now we're going to look at a series of representational quotes from some of the church fathers, just to give you an idea of how bad this became and how vitriolic the rhetoric became between Christians and Jews. Here is the great church father Origen, and he wrote this about the Jews. The Jews' rejection of Jesus has resulted in their present calamity and exile. We say with confidence that they will never be restored to their former condition, for they committed a crime of the most unhallowed kind in conspiring against the Savior of the human race. Gregory of Nyssa wrote this: The Jews are slayers of the Lord, murderers of the prophets, enemies of God, haters of God, adversaries of grace, enemies of their fathers' faith, advocates of the devil, brood of vipers, slanderers, scoffers, men of darkened minds, leaven of the Pharisees, congregation of demons, sinners, wicked men, stoners, and haters of goodness. St. Jerome called the Jews serpents, haters of all men, and Judases. Their psalms and prayers are the braying of donkeys. St. John Chrysostom, not to be surpassed, wrote 8 extremely aggressive and vitriolic homilies against the Jews. Here are just a few excerpts. The Jews are most miserable of all men, lustful, rapacious, greedy, perfidious bandits, inveterate murderers, destroyers, men possessed by the devil, whom debauchery and drunkenness have given them the manners of the pig and the lusty goat. They are impure and impious, they murder their offspring and immolate them to the devil. The synagogue is an assembly of criminals, a den of thieves, a cavern of devils, an abyss of perdition. It is the domicile of the devil, as is also the souls of the Jews. Their rites are criminal and impure. Their religion is a disease. Still Chrysostom. For the Jews' odious assassination of Christ, there is no expiation possible, no indulgence, no pardon. Their rejection and dispersion was done by the wrath of God and his absolute abandon of you. Thus the Jews live under the yoke of servitude without end. God hates the Jews and always hated the Jews. He who can never love Christ enough will never have done fighting against those Jews who hate him. Flee then their assemblies, flee their houses, and far from venerating the synagogue because of the books it contains, hold it in hatred and aversion for the same reason. I hate the synagogue precisely because it has the law and prophets. I hate the Jews also because they outrage the law. Remember the Abrahamic blessing. I will bless those who bless you, but those who curse you I will curse. Remember St. Paul's warning, do not become arrogant toward the branches. In what direction is the church going here? St. Augustine's rhetoric is more measured than Chrysostom, but in some ways he was even more influential. Augustine sees the Jews as a witness people. They must survive in humiliation and hardship and give witness to Christian truth by their dispersion and their woes. For Augustine, the Jews are like Cain. They carry a sign which is a type of mark of protection, so they are not to be killed, but they should remain humiliated to point to the truth of the Christian faith. As Esau and Jacob, the older brother, and so now Esau becomes identified with Israel, will serve the younger, and the younger brother, namely Jacob, becomes identified with the church. As I said last time, this is a shift in the role of Jacob and Esau, whereas originally Jacob was Israel and Esau became a sign or symbol of the church. Now, following Augustine, the church flips that around by saying that Esau is in fact Israel, and Jacob is the church that has stolen the blessing from the older brother. Now, St. Augustine says that Christians have a duty to love the Jews and lead them to Christ, but with this kind of love, we wonder how effective this would have been. right? So for Augustine, he sees the Jews as the slave librarians. They still carry the books of the law and the prophets, but these books point to the truth of the Christian faith, and so the Jews should be humiliated and remain in this humiliated state as long as human history continues to point to the failure of the Jews to identify and recognize the Messiah and to follow him. Theology is not without consequences. Ideas have consequences. So we begin with this sharp patristic rhetoric against the Jews. At first, it's a theological debate, but this is soon going to turn into anti-Jewish legislation. Jews and Christians eventually are not permitted to intermarry or eat together. That's the Synod of Elvira in 306 AD. The Codex Theodosianus establishes basic rights and freedoms for the Jews. It prohibits injustices or violence against them, but it also restricts their cult and their activities. Later, the Justinian Code is much harsher. It forbids Jews to own Christian slaves or to hold public office. It intrudes on the Jewish cult and bans the Mishnah, the first major compilation of the Jewish law. Christians are not permitted to patronize Jewish doctors, the Trullianic Synod of 692, and eventually at the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215, and that is an ecumenical council, Jews are mandated to mark their clothes with a badge, as you can see here on the picture, a Jew wearing the yellow circle, which all Jews were forced by law to wear. So really humiliating legislation here coming from church councils. Eventually, Jews are obliged to reside in compulsory ghettos, as mandated by the Synod of Vienna in 1267. So an increasing anti-Jewish legislation that increasingly discriminates against the Jews and undermines their rights. Increasing enmity. We're seeing more and more popular outbreaks, including, at first, Jewish violence against Christians, but very soon that is reversed, and you see much more Christian violence against the Jews. This includes the burning and confiscation of synagogues by Christian mobs, the compulsory listening of Christian sermons, and more we are seeing forced baptisms, where Jews are completely compelled to be baptized. Still, in every age, some Christians and Catholics were defenders of the Jews. For example, Pope Gregory the Great opposed forced baptisms. He defended the rights of the Jews, and he intervened when synagogues were violated. Under Charlemagne, the Jews had their rights relatively respected, and under Louis the Pious, Jews enjoyed a high standing in society. So that is the Carolingian Empire, especially based in France. Still, generally, the situation of the Jews was not improving, and throughout the beginning of the Middle Ages, we know that Christians always tried to convert Jews, but they tried to enact what we now know as a policy of assimilation. In other words, any Jew that converted to Christianity was compelled to completely reject anything and everything that had to do with Judaism. This is expressed here in some professions of faith that were extracted from Jews at baptism. So look at how this worked. Imagine a Jew was baptized to be received into the Catholic Church. This Jew had to profess this profession of faith. I do here and now renounce every rite and observance of the Jewish religion, detesting all its most solemn ceremonies and tenets that in former days I kept and held. In the future I will practice no rite or celebration connected with it, nor any custom of my past error. I promise that I will never return to the vomit of Jewish superstition. Never again will I fulfill any of the offices of Jewish ceremonies to which I was addicted, nor evermore hold them dear. Pretty harsh, but there is worse. Here's another profession of faith. I renounce the whole worship of the Hebrews, circumcision, all its legalisms, unleavened bread, Passover, the sacrificing of lambs, the Feast of Weeks, Jubilees, trumpets, atonement, tabernacles, and all the other Hebrew feasts. And I absolutely renounce every custom and institution of the Jewish laws. A third profession of faith. If I wander from the straight path in any way and defile the holy faith, and try to observe any rites of the Jewish sect, then may all the curses of the law fall upon me. May there fall upon me and upon my house, and all my children, all the plagues which smote Egypt, and to the horror of others may I suffer, in addition the faith of Datan and Abiram, so that the earth shall swallow me alive. And after I am deprived of this life, I shall be handed over to the eternal fire, in the company of the devil and his angels, sharing with the dwellers in Sodom, and with Judas the punishment of burning. I don't know about you, but this would be a bit of a cold shower on my baptismal ceremony. So these professions of faith are truly horrible because they mandate Jews to completely sever themselves from their entire tradition, portraying really Catholicism not as a fulfillment of Judaism, but as a total revocation of Judaism. Now, the big question here, if you recall, we read from Jeremiah 31 last time, which not only announced the new covenant, but where God promised that he would preserve Israel as a nation before him as long as the covenant with the sun, the moon, and the stars endures. So how can this policy of assimilation be reconciled with God's will that Israel should remain his permanent nation and witness throughout this world? Obviously, if this policy of assimilation would have succeeded, this would have meant the complete end of the Jewish people. They would have been assimilated and would have disappeared and been dissolved in the church. Obviously, this policy did not work because very few Jews agreed to convert throughout history. We now come to Christian anti-Semitism in the High Middle Ages. Here is again Flannery, who writes, "While the church and the Christian state were at the zenith of their power and influence, the sons of Israel reached the nadir of their unending oppression." Infamous in the Middle Ages, as we saw in our study of church history, are the Crusades. We know that the Crusaders went to the Holy Land to deliver it from the Muslims, but what is often forgotten is that during the First Crusade, there was a massacre of some 12,000 Jews on the Rhine. Now, the local bishops tried to protect the Jews, but still the rampaging Crusaders enacted these horrific massacres of Jews in Germany on their way to the Promised Land. And once they did arrive in Jerusalem, they put all the Jews in the synagogue and burnt it down with the Jews inside of it. So the Crusades remain still a trauma to the Jewish people as well as to the Muslims until this day. The Middle Ages was also the time of blood libels and ritual murder. Jews were accused of murdering Christian children and of using their blood in preparation of the unleavened bread for Passover. This began in the 12th century, and we're not talking about a few isolated events. It persisted for centuries. Of course, an absurd accusation because Jews are forbidden from eating or drinking blood. So it's completely preposterous that Jews would take Christian blood to make unleavened bread for Passover. And you can see an authentic illustration here on the screen of an alleged blood libel where the Jews are killing a Christian child to take its blood for the Passover bread. Again, very often the popes were the friends of the Jews, or at least less hostile to the Jews, and many of them exonerated the Jews from these mythical charges, such as Innocent IV, Gregory X, Martin V, and others. There were yet more mythical accusations during the Middle Ages. The Jews were accused of poisoning the wells in France. 5,000 of them were burnt at the stake. Again, here's an image of a Jew allegedly poisoning a well. The Jews were even blamed for the bubonic plague in 1348. Again, thousands were killed. Host desecration. Jews were also accused of defiling the Eucharistic host, and the accused were often burnt alive. Again, you can see on the illustration here, Jews are stabbing the Eucharistic host in an attempt to re-crucify Christ by desecrating the Eucharist. So as you can see, these were quite prevalent in the Middle Ages, and we have much art that still testifies to it. So here are some more examples. Here's another Jew who is in the process of desecrating the host, basically stabbing the Eucharist. Here you can see the Jews that are sucking from this swine, from this pig. Here you can see the Jews who are portrayed as devils. And here you see a Christian priest who is on his deathbed, and you can see the horrible, devilish figure of the Jew who is waiting, trying to steal his soul. And here you can see the Jews who are attacking and persecuting Christ. Again, these quasi-demonic figures as he is on his way to his passion. Here too you can see a Jew wearing the stereotypical hat who is in the process of stabbing Christ through the heart as he is dying on the cross. So we have much evidence of all this anti-Semitic art from the Middle Ages. Coming towards the later Middle Ages, there were also instances of burning the Talmud. Following the Paris Disputation in 1240, the Talmud is seen as a book of anti-Christian hatred. Pope Gregory IX orders the Talmud to be burned, so also the destruction of the Jewish sacred books. Another age that remains an embarrassment to Christians is that of the Spanish Inquisition. So the Inquisition persecuted and tortured the Marranos. Who are they? They are Jewish converts to Christianity who were suspected of still secretly practicing Judaism. So the Inquisition did not technically go after Jews, but it went after Jewish converts who were suspected of still practicing some aspects of Judaism. Once again, we see that the popes often were the allies of the Jews. Pope Clement VII suspends the Spanish Inquisition against the Marranos, but once again, this was after much death and much trauma, especially in Spain. But it was not the end of their trauma. There were massive expulsions of entire Jewish populations throughout Western Europe. The Jews are banished from England in 1290. They were banished 3 times from France in 1182, 1306, and 1394. They were banished entirely from Spain in 1492, the year when Columbus discovered America, and 5 years later from Portugal. So we see a massive exodus of the Jewish population from the major countries of Western Europe. Once again, recall the Abrahamic blessing. I will bless those who bless you. Those who curse you, I will curse. And recall St. Paul's warning, do not boast against the branches, because God may also cut you off. With the resettling of all these Jews from Western Europe, many of them moved to Eastern Europe, and this begins the age of the ghetto. Jews resettle in Eastern Europe, including the Balkans, Poland, Turkey, and what was then known as Palestine. So we see the creation of ghettos, for example, in Prague, in Venice, in Frankfurt, and in Rome. Many of these become centers of Talmudic study, and under Cromwell, the Jews are readmitted in England in 1655. But these ghettos in Eastern Europe were hardly safe havens for the Jews. In fact, many of them were attacked. As we see here on the slide, the Frankfurt Jewish ghetto was attacked in 1614. On this map, we can see the resettlement of the Jews, the areas of expulsion in yellow, and many of them resettled in Eastern Europe. So here we see the settlement of the Jewish ghettos from 1215 to 1870. So massive forced migration, yet another trauma in the Jewish consciousness. As we come to the modern times, we see a morphing of anti-Judaism, which so far had been mostly an inter-religious debate, right? If Jews converted to Christianity, then they were considered friends, right? They had switched over from the side of unbelief to the side of faith. But with modern times, despite emancipation and assimilation, anti-Semitism persists in the modern world. So we see a shift from religious anti-Judaism that turns into racial anti-Semitism. And you can see some illustrations of typical anti-Semitic art from the 19th century. The Dreyfus Affair was a major turning point in France in the late 19th century, and it was observed by a young man called Theodore Herzl. This was a Jewish officer in the French army who was unjustly blamed and put on trial and humiliated. And as it turns out, this was largely motivated by anti-Semitic sentiments in French society. Here we see another anti-Semitic illustration, The Dream of the Hebrew Usurers, a French postcard from 1905. And there is the Jew trying to control the world, the protocols of the elders of Zion, a forgery that maligned and vilified Jews that some anti-Semites still read today and believe that it is authentic. In the late 19th century, the Jews must suffer more affliction through the pogroms in Russia. Mobs attack Jewish communities and carry out organized massacres, with thousands killed in several waves of violence. And it's at that time in the late 19th century and early 20th century that hundreds of thousands of Jews emigrate, with most going to the USA. So that's the origin of the Jewish community in the United States. All this is going to lead to the final solution under Nazi Germany. With the rise of Hitler and the Third Reich, this persecution of the Jews will reach its most horrific conclusion. First, it begins with ostracization from society and turns into persecution, and eventually will devolve into mass murder in the death camps. So as we look at this final solution under Nazi Germany, there is something very disturbing, obviously, about the history that led to it. Even though Nazi Germany and Nazism was not a Christian phenomenon, as we're going to see, the question is whether Nazism would have been possible had there not been this current of anti-Semitism, this growing anti-Judaism and anti-Semitism that continued rearing its ugly head throughout Christian Europe. And this is where we see a great mystery in the suffering of the Jewish people, that in many ways they follow the path of their crucified Messiah. So here we see the crucified Messiah who is not on his own, and the Jewish people are not on their own. They are continuing this path of suffering, of rejection, of persecution, and ultimately of crucifixion together with their Messiah. The suffering servant of the Lord. There's a lot of debate in biblical exegesis. Who does it refer to? The Jews say that it refers to Israel. The Christians say it refers to Jesus. Well, possibly it's both. We really see a close identification between the suffering of the Messiah and the suffering of the Jewish people. Indeed, after the Second World War, we see the beginning of a deeper theological reflection on the sufferings of Israel and the identification of the Jewish people with the cross of the Messiah. Here is the great French philosopher Jacques Maritain, who wrote, "The passion of Israel is more and more clearly taking the shape of the cross, and the agony of the Jews is one in which Christ participates." Still Maritain, the Jewish diaspora within Christian Europe is one long Via Dolorosa. Elias Friedman, the founder of the Association of Hebrew Catholics, wrote, "As he walked slowly across the stage of history, the Jew took on an uncanny resemblance to Jesus, beaten, spat upon, mocked, derided, bleeding from his judicial scourging, crowned with the thorns of incomprehension, bearing his cross of the way to Golgotha. Mystically speaking, Jewry as a whole was nailed to the cross and died under Hitler." Another one who reflected on the suffering of the Jewish people is a great Jewish Catholic, Edith Stein, and her reflections on the Holocaust in which she herself would die. She wrote this, "I spoke with the Savior to tell him that I realized it was his cross that was now being laid upon the Jewish people, that the few who understood this had the responsibility of carrying it in the name of all, and that I myself was willing to do this, if he would only show me how." She also wrote, "This is the shadow of the cross that falls upon my people. Oh, if they would only realize, that is the fulfillment of the curse which my people have called upon themselves." Very shocking words on the part of Edith Stein. Now, this type of reflection even moved to an official level in the Catholic Church. Here's a document published by the Commission for the Religious Relations with the Jews, published in 1998, called "We Remember, a Reflection on the Shoah." That's the Jewish term for the Holocaust. So this document raises this very difficult question. It says, "It may be asked whether the Nazi persecution of the Jews was not made easier by the anti-Jewish prejudices embedded in some Christian minds and hearts. Did anti-Jewish sentiment among Christians make them less sensitive or even indifferent to the persecutions launched against the Jews by National Socialism when it reached power?" Another statement called Dabru Emet, a Jewish statement on Christians and Christianity, writes this, "Without the long history of Christian anti-Judaism and Christian violence against Jews, Nazi ideology could not have taken hold, nor could it have been carried out." Other philosophers and theologians carried this thought even further. They talked about how this hatred of Israel is a type of unconscious hatred of Christ. Here is again Edward Flannery. Was not this the supreme defection, that the most severely and persistently persecuted of Christian history were not those to whom persecution was promised by the Master, that is, Christians, but rather the people from which he came, that is, the Jews? Still, Father Edward Flannery, some have perceived in the hatred of the Jew an unconscious hatred of Christ, a rebellion against the Christian yoke no longer found sweet, in a word, a Christophobia. Incapable of hating Christianity openly, the Christian anti-Semite, through an unconscious displacement of affect, diverts his animus to the Jews, kinsmen of its founder. So the hatred of Israel is a type of unconscious Christophobia, a type of hatred of Christ, but that is deflected, that is displaced against the people from whom Christ came. Jewish philosopher Maurice Samuel said this even more powerfully. He said, "Anti-Semites must spit on the Jews as the Christ killers because they long to spit on the Jews as the Christ givers." This is an examination of conscience for all Christians because Christians have played a part in Israel's passion. Arguably, we could even say that just as the Jewish leaders have treated the Messiah, taking him to death, so have Christians treated the Jews, crucifying the Messiah anew in their persecution of the Jewish people. This is not just my idea. This is something that Christian philosophers and theologians and even official church documents have reflected on, even popes. And here is Pope St. John Paul II, who is quoted in the same document. We remember a reflection on the Shoah, and John Paul II said this: "In the Christian world, erroneous and unjust interpretations of the New Testament regarding the Jewish people and their alleged culpability have circulated for too long, engendering feelings of hostility towards this people. Such interpretations of the New Testament have been totally and definitively rejected by the Second Vatican Council." So Pope John Paul II here is saying there have been some very bad interpretations of Scripture of the New Testament regarding the culpability of the Jewish people, and this now the Church has entirely rejected. So since the Second Vatican Council, in fact, since the Shoah, the Holocaust, there needs to be a complete rethinking of how Christians approach the Scriptures and their own tradition and their own relationship with the Jewish people. Let's go back to St. Paul. We have seen some grueling texts, a lot of aggressive anti-Judaism from the Church Fathers that turn into anti-Jewish legislation, persecution, and even killings and mass murder. Now let's go back to St. Paul. What does St. Paul say about the mystery of Israel? He asks the question, has God rejected his people? And he answers, God forbid, by no means. Have they stumbled so as to fall? By no means. But through their stumbling, salvation has come to the Gentiles, so as to make Israel jealous. For if their rejection is the reconciliation of the world, what will their acceptance be but life from the dead? This is the mystery of Israel. St. Paul reflects on Israel's rejection of Christ, and he's saying, well, through their stumbling, by the very fact that they did not recognize the Messiah, salvation has come to the Gentiles to make Israel jealous. And if this rejection of the Messiah was reconciliation for the world, how much more will their acceptance be but life from the dead for all nations? St. Paul goes on to say, a hardening has come upon part of Israel until the full number of the Gentiles has come in. And so all Israel will be saved, says St. Paul. He has deep confidence that the people of Israel will indeed attain salvation. In Romans 11, verses 28 to 29, he says this, as regards the gospel, they are enemies for your sake, but as regards election, they are beloved for the sake of their ancestors. For the gifts and the calling of God are irrevocable. The gifts and the calling of God to Israel cannot be revoked. They are permanent. Earlier, we talked about the olive tree, still in Romans 11, and here let's trace this in more graphic form. Remember that Paul warned the Gentiles. He says, yes, some natural branches have been cut off. And here these centuries are just a very broad ballpark approximation. But let's look at how this matches the history of Jewish-Christian relations. So first Paul says, yes, natural branches have been cut off. Jews have rejected the gospel, and this occurred largely in the first century. But remember what Paul says also, do not boast against the branches. And now many wild branches were grafted in. This points to the Gentiles who accepted the gospel from roughly the 1st to the 17th century. Of course, Gentiles still continue to accept the gospel, but we see a great rise and growth of Christianity throughout much of the history of Christendom up until the Enlightenment. But Paul warns the Gentiles, do not become arrogant because God may also cut you off. And what has happened since the time of the Enlightenment, especially in the Western world, Europe and North America, we see a massive cutting of the wild branches. We see more and more Gentiles who fall away from the faith. So a good question is there any correlation? The blessing of Abraham, those who bless you, I will bless. Those who curse you, I will curse. St. Paul, do not boast over the branches because God may also cut you off. So is there a connection in how Christians have treated the Jews? Christians, for most of Christian history, have not been a blessing to the Jews. They have been a curse to the Jews. How has that played out in formerly Christian Europe? We see the massive cutting off of the branches, a type of massive apostasy of the Gentiles since the time of the Enlightenment. And what is the last step? Paul is confident that the natural branches of Israel, the Jews, will be grafted back into their own olive tree. And this, perhaps we are close to that moment in the 21st century in preparation for the second coming of the Messiah. We have walked through a difficult and often heartbreaking chapter of the story: the early separation between Israel and the church, the long centuries of exile, persecution, and misunderstanding, and the immense suffering of the Jewish people, culminating in the horrors of the Shoah. These events are wounds in the body of God's own first chosen people, and they are wounds that Christians must acknowledge with honesty and sorrow, because they bear responsibility for having inflicted many of these wounds upon Israel. But the passion is never the end of God's story. Just as the cross leads to resurrection, so too the suffering of Israel points towards a future that the prophets never ceased to proclaim: a return to the land, a renewal of the heart, a restored covenant, and a reconciliation that only God can accomplish. In the next part, we lift our eyes toward that horizon. We look at the prophetic promises of restoration, the modern return of the Jewish people to their land, and the New Testament's vision of a final union between Israel and the church. And we will ask what it means to live today in the light of that resurrection. Part 3 begins with hope. Hope rooted in God's fidelity. Hope that looks beyond suffering toward the day when all things are made new. I will see you then. Shalom and God bless.